Hey everyone, and welcome to this live stream. I am Kevin Gosztola, managing editor for Shadowproof. I'm also the host of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast with Rania Kalik. I'm going to be joined in just a moment by Mohamed Elmaazi, who is a journalist. We've both covered the Julian Assange case very closely. I'm based in the United States. He's based in the United Kingdom, in and around London. And it is the 2-year anniversary of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange and his arrest and detention in the Belmarsh prison. That is on April 11th, 2019. Julian Assange was expelled from the embassy. The Ecuador authorities decided to invite the British police into the London embassy to allow the US to be able to get their hands on Julian Assange finally. This was the culmination of a pressure campaign that was unfolding against Assange for the last couple of years. And so we will now bring in Mohamed, who I believe is ready to join the live. Hey, Mohamed, welcome. And I think can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly, yes.
Great, awesome. So I was just I fired it up and got us started. I was letting people know why we are doing this live broadcast. There are actions happening all over the world in the last 24 hours to mark this case. There's quite a lot of organizing that has gone on with people who are supporters of Julian Assange, and some of them also being advocates for press freedom. And we've seen messages recorded by a few parliamentarians from parts of the world. So just for everyone who doesn't know, this is Mohamed. You've contributed pieces to Jacobin and to the Grayzone and the Canary. So welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Glad I was able to do something that got the camera working in the end. I was getting kind of nervous.
No, you're looking good. We can see you clearly. And we've got a few questions here right off the bat. So as we get into what's going on with the anniversary actions, I suppose I can we can do a little bit of housekeeping at the top here. Just a general question from one of our viewers is asking about whether the United States has officially appealed this decision to not extradite. I'll let you say whatever you have to say about where we are right now in the case, because that's certainly why I invited you on to talk about the state of play and where we think things could go next in this case. But we do have a filing from the United States. Back in January, they did officially appeal this case.
Yeah, that's right. So the United States is appealing, and it has submitted its appeal against the judge's ruling whereby Judge Vanessa Breitzer determined that Julian Assange should not be extradited, but based on medical grounds, that he was at substantial risk of self-harm and suicide. And although she found against the defense's arguments in every other point, pretty much, so it was almost 95 to 99% of her judgment agreed with the prosecution, except on the health matter. So, but for Julian Assange's health and the conditions in which he'd be detained in the United States, she would have granted extradition. Now, what happens is the defense also get to reply, right, to the submissions in the appeal that the US government has made. And it looks like the defense, and I'm assuming they have now filed their cross appeal as well. So just to not to make things more too complicated, but the prosecution is appealing, as I just said, on the health grounds matter. They think Assange should be extradited, but the defense, in addition to challenging that, obviously, they have their own issues that they'd like to appeal on, namely matters where the judge sided with the prosecution. So whether it's politically motivated prosecution, or the fact that the extradition would infringe on fundamental rights and freedoms, in particular the right to receive and impart information, which in the United States is enshrined under the First Amendment. We don't have a single written constitution here in the UK, but there is the European Convention on Human Rights, which is sort of ratified in UK law under the Human Rights Act of 1998. So, relatively recently. But even then, courts in this country can't strike down legislation as being unconstitutional the way they can in the United States. That's not possible here. So they could pass the most horrifically draconian law here, and the courts would say, well, that's democracy. Parliament is democracy, basically. And so that is the current state of play. We're waiting to see, and I'm trying to see if I can't get a copy of both the submissions made by the defense and by the prosecution, just so I can read through God knows how many pages.
Yeah, I'm working on obtaining that as well. But it's my understanding, at least what it's been represented to me, is that the High Court of Justice, until they agree to hear this case, it's fairly customary to keep this private until they've agreed to hear the case.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing, is though, so although appeals have been lodged, they still have to be granted permission to appeal. So it's basically like a high court judge will look at the arguments, and I suppose in essence they've got to make a determination: is there at least an arguable case in law here, or am I going to be wasting my time? If they think it satisfies whatever the threshold in this case is necessary to satisfy to hear an appeal, then it will go on to the next stage where an appeal will actually be heard. Sometimes these things are done in tandem. I don't know about extradition, so I won't relate it to that, but I worked on a case once that was heard at the Court of Appeal, where we were seeking permission to appeal, and they granted it in the end, but they also found in our favor. It was all done at the same time. So like we're granting, so sometimes that does happen. I'm not saying that would happen here. So yeah, basically, and there is no fixed date. It could happen in April. It could happen in May. It's down to the court,
right,
and this other cases caseload.
Yeah. And so what we're saying for people who are catching up on the latest in the case is that there is a cross appeal, but to be clear, this doesn't create any liability for Assange. It doesn't make any kind of risk for the defense if they were to lose their arguments, because the judge already found in Julian Assange's favor that he should not be extradited to the United States. And so the burden is still going to be on the United States to convince the High Court that he should not be brought to the U.S. around those narrow issues that were the focus of the judge's rejection of Vanessa Baretzer's decision, where she concluded that the prison system in the United States would be inhumane, if not inhospitable, for Julian Assange as he experiences his issues with his mental health and other things related to how the U.S. confines prisoners or detainees while they're awaiting trial.
Yeah, that's correct.
So let's get to some of the action that we've had for the last 24 hours. A lot of this is to the credit of people who organize under the banner of Candles for Assange or Action for Assange. There's a lot of disparate groups. There's people spread out through the world, but I have before me that they were able to get 30 cities to participate throughout the world in the day's action. That's 12 different countries. So not just the countries that are implicated in this case, but we have 12 different countries, 5 continents. Unfortunately, they haven't been able to get a demonstration on Antarctica. I'm a bit surprised that there isn't one that they know of on the African continent. That seems kind of stunning to me. We could at least get some people out in Kenya, you would think, given Assange's history. Also, there was some of these releases that fly under the radar, but was it called fish rot, or what was there was a recent release that involved a African country that WikiLeaks published documents about, and I think it involved fishing. So anyways, they have these actions that have been going on. Of course, some of the earliest people to come out were in New Zealand and Australia. And then, now as we do this live stream, we're seeing people show up in the United States. But then for you in London, do you want to say a little bit about what people have been doing in the UK today?
Sure. So there have been, just so people know, at least in terms of our side of the planet, if you can call it that, in Brussels, there was a small vigil in the theater, at the National Theater, at the Newtown Festival in New Zealand. There was also like a banner and a number of people that gathered up, which is apparently a very big festival there. And then in the UK, as you say, so that's both London and Edinburgh, if not other parts of the UK. I know at least of London and Edinburgh, there have been demonstrations. In particular in London, supporters booked a London bus that made its way from the Ecuadorian embassy to the Westminster Magistrates Court, which is the court that's heard the case, and then eventually down to Belmarsh, where Julian Assange is still being held. In fact, today, I think you'll have mentioned at the beginning, is the 2-year anniversary of his being held at Belmarsh. Yeah, it seemed a very cheery mood, very upbeat. People can see there's an excellent Twitter thread by Gordon Dimick, who's a journalist and podcaster who was there with these people. And where at each place they'd stop, people would be cheering and chanting, and a speech might be given. Fidel Narvaez, a former counsel to the Ecuadorian embassy when Julian Assange was there, a diplomat, he gave a speech. And yeah, if people can check out the video footage, it's quite heartening, right? So even though people are, they're upset, of course, that Julian Assange remains in custody. They're upset that despite the judge ruling in his favor, she still hasn't granted bail, and that the appeal is being lodged. But it is amazing the extent to which they have persevered. I was just thinking earlier today, if I'm ever targeted, I really hope that people who've shown as much commitment and perseverance over these years with Julian Assange are somehow available for me, because it's whether it's raining, it's whether it's hot, or today it's pretty chilly. And yeah, they're there in full force, both independent media people. I can oversee somebody there from Let Me Look TV, and as well as yeah, a number of other people who some of the organizers will include Alison and Sabine, or people connected to the JDC, or the Julian Assange Defense Committee. And yeah, people should take a look. A van, a bus, one of those advertising buses with a giant poster on it has been circling around the area, and that was happening, I think, yesterday as well. I think there might have been something similar in the United States, one of those "Don't Extradite Julian Assange" vans that are paid just to drive around.
Yeah, there's advertising. There's definitely advertising that has been out. They recognize. They got the billboard together of it. So let me take this down, and then I'll pull it back up in just a moment, because there's a clip we wanted to show from in the tunnel. Just a fun clip that supporters were able to put together. And but yeah, just to finish my thought, they did rent this billboard, and we could talk a little bit about the framing, because it's been a source of debate for people who are supporters and others who have followed the Joe Biden's career closely, and also the first, it's not the 100th day yet in his presidency, but people who are highly skeptical that Joe Biden are going to do anything are questioning. But we saw with the well, here I'll do it this way. I'll show you what I'm talking about by putting the, so this is the billboard I'm going to share, and this is in DC that they are this is in DC that they're doing this, that they have this billboard. So you can see that in DC they've got this massive billboard, and they put this message on the billboard that has some people debating whether this is the right approach to handling it, because it's looking at the political differences between Joe Biden's administration, or the political differences between the Obama administration, with which Biden was a part of, and then saying Trump did this. And they're sort of playing on this thing of, well, Biden's supposed to undo everything that Trump has done. So this is something that Trump's administration did, so Biden should naturally undo the prosecution against Assange. But let's just, you can mull that over in your head, Mohamed. We'll talk about that, and after we come back with I want to show this first. So where is this? I'm not in London, so where is this happening? This tunnel clip? Where are they?
So this is on their way. I think this is when they're making their way. They're going through a bridge, if that's what I'm underneath. Not underneath the bridge. Sorry, underneath a tunnel. Is it? It's not Blackfriar. Hold on. Let me see. Let me see it. Blackwall Tunnel. Right. And I'm thinking this is this on their way to Belmarsh. From it's okay, it's a pair of road tunnels underneath the River Thames in East London, linking the London Borough of Tower Hamlets with the Royal Borough of Greenwich. Okay, so I don't know if this is where they're making their way actually to Belmarsh.
It said it was Blackwall. They said the thing says
it is Blackwall. Yeah, it is Blackwall. Yeah.
Now, I don't know if it's going to cooperate and we'll be able to hear the audio, but we can at least watch this.
Yeah, so it's quite funny to be able to recognize so many of these faces, actually.
Yeah.
And this is being taken by Drew of Let Me Look TV, Drew McFadden, who's also director of an excellent documentary, The Great NHS Heist, about the privatization, 40 years of privatization of the National Health Service. People should absolutely check that out. I keep trying to get more Americans to see it, because I keep hearing Americans say everywhere in the world, everywhere else in the world, they've got, universal healthcare, this, that, and the other. And I think there's a big part of the story that people don't understand, that the privatization of healthcare systems elsewhere has been happening. We call it here the Americanization of the healthcare system. But it is no place is left untouched. Like this is not the NHS that once was 40 years ago. It's very evident for anybody who looks at it that it is being privatized, and has been since the era of Margaret Thatcher, just very slowly by stealth. each government has done their part to undermine it more and more.
So
So
this is a pretty
yeah,
long tunnel, right?
it is. Look at that.
Yeah. I mean, this would make a nice screensaver for.
I was thinking that. Yeah.
You could put this up, and it's just have it on loop.
Yeah, I was about to say it's like a GIF. It's almost a GIF.
I mean, it almost doesn't look like they're moving, but they are, right? Like this is how long the tunnel is, and I mean, unfortunately I can't get the audio to come through. It's settings are kind of weird on my end, but yeah, so they're there. They came out, and you can see them. I don't know what's behind them. What's that? Is that an arena? Are they over by some kind of like football arena?
That's not the Millennium Dome, is it? Oh God, somebody's going to like tweet at me and say like, no, of course it's not, you idiot. But from what I can remember, the whole thing about the Millennium Dome when it was finished was that it was hideous, and that looks hideous. So I think that might be it. The thing that was made for the. Let me check it out. But as you go on. Oh, by the way,
right, so
yeah, go ahead. Your question.
Let's return us to the political question that we'll be endlessly debating as long as these charges exist, which is, how much of this frame is useful in. So I'll say that while you're looking for whatever you're looking for.
No, that is the Millennium Dome, by the way. I looked
okay.
It up. It is that hideous building behind them. All right.
So I'll say that the legal team made the issues with the politicization of the Trump Justice Department a part of their closing argument. And there was a lot of focus on what Mike Pompeo did as a CIA director, and the way in which Attorney General Jeff Sessions was political in his focus on going after leaks, and that there was other aspects of the case that they used to bring out the politics of the Trump administration. Certainly I remember when we watched the extradition trial, there was one day where we heard testimony about Bill Barr and his theory of how the judiciary is supposed to operate in a country, and that it can be a political arm of the government, basically, that it can take instruction from the executive. That doesn't have to be separate from. This is something that people are. A lot of it has to do with just this concern that people are giving Biden too much credit, I think. And I know it's difficult, but I feel like you've got to have you almost have to have two positions that seem like they're competing, which is just like, one is I don't really think Biden is on our side. Otherwise the charges would be dropped already. But then the other thing is like, well, he was part of the Obama administration, and then the legal team will tell you that the charges were not introduced when Obama was president. They were introduced when Trump was president.
Yes, I mean, first of all, I think that much was made about Trump's attacking of the media, right? And I'm pretty sure Biden made part of his agenda that their relationship with the media would be different. And so I've never seen that billboard before, the one that you showed that's on that van, but to show Biden in the shadow with the what is that, with Trump's facade, right? So if you see the shadow, Biden's shadow, it actually looks like Trump. And I think that's quite clever, because it's like, well, you say that this is a departure. This prosecution began, as you say, under Trump, not under Obama, even though, of course, the whole process did begin under Obama, right? But the actual charges, with all those Espionage Act charges and the whole arrangement that resulted and Julian Assange being dragged out of the embassy, this occurred under Trump. So it was almost like Obama got the best of both worlds, where Julian didn't feel safe to leave, but the Obama administration, having concluded apparently internally, the DOJ, that they couldn't prosecute Julian Assange without opening the door to prosecution of the New York Times, what they referred to as the New York Times problem. Yeah, you're right. There, it is fair, I think, to bring this up. Okay, if you say that you're a departure from Trump, well, let's see it. Especially given those comments that we heard from the former lead prosecutor in the case under Trump, who, when he was leaving, that's it. He's going into private practice, right? If he hasn't already left, he spoke to, I think, NPR. I was reading the transcript of an NPR interview he gave, where he said, he said it's not actually clear that the prosecution would necessarily continue, with the next administration because of the expense and the time. I mean, he didn't go so far as to say because this is a bogus prosecution or we should never have brought it. But it does seem like an interesting thing for someone to say when they've spent so much time, money, and resources pursuing the prosecution. And now that there's a new government coming in and he's on his way out to go into private practice, he's like, yeah, I don't know if this prosecution will necessarily continue under the Biden administration. Therefore, reflecting the significance of the position of the presidency, that this is almost he's almost admitting what the defense have been arguing, is that this is a political offense. So it's ultimately down to a political calculation being made by the government rather than a purely criminal justice calculation that, oh, we think these laws were broken and therefore we must enforce the law. So on that end, I think I personally don't have an issue with that poster given that context. Yeah, because it's not saying all hail Biden. You know what I mean? It's saying Biden stopped this prosecution that began. Who knows? Maybe the next poster will be stop the Biden prosecution if it's gone on for too long,
Yeah, I think it's an issue of recognizing the difference between what an administration can do and what they will do. And I can't predict the future. You can't predict the future. But I think everyone knows it's well within the Justice Department's authority to drop the charges, which is why all these activists around the world, press freedom organizations, civil liberties organizations, human rights organizations are demanding that the Justice Department under Biden take this step to abandon the case. And asking, it's actually a pretty low ask to demand that they abandon the case, because there's a lot that's happened so far. Is when you think of the rights violations that have piled up, and the way that the UK, Sweden, Ecuador, and the US have together treated Julian Assange. So to just say, abandon it, let him go live with his family, is actually a pretty good compromise. It's actually a pretty soft demand for the Biden administration as far as what they would have to deal with. And the other thing that I'll say is that I'm not an activist. And I mean that because I don't go organize people in the streets. And I feel like that takes a lot of work, and I don't mobilize people. But, as a journalist, I do think there is a difference between talking about what a presidential administration can do and what a presidential administration should do. And I also recognize that, like, where activism makes its most gains is when they're able to take advantage of these contradictions that we're talking about. So when you have a Biden administration that says it is for press freedom and wants to use it in order to make the United States seem like they're better than China or Russia or Iran or whatever country they want to challenge, then you would have this example that's so clear that it's just right in your face that a publisher is in prison. And until you get him free, until you set him free and abandon this case, you can't really say anything about press freedom and mean it. It just cannot be taken seriously.
Yeah, you're right. The charges of hypocrisy, which is a point that Stella Moraes, Julian Assange's fiancée, raised in an article, well, in an interview that was published in the Guardian. I think it was today, right? On the second anniversary of Julian's incarceration. That's exactly the point she's raised. Um, but I mean, if you see the number of outlets, even establishment outlets, albeit belatedly, that have started to make stronger noises. I say belatedly because they could have been making noises much clearer 2 years ago when he was first dragged out, or even well before that when he was in the Ecuadorian embassy, instead of just sort of focusing on his character defects or even just alleged character or personality traits. It seemed, very strange for this to be the focus of the press. But I wouldn't knock their involvement. You'd think that Biden's less likely to care what Shadowproof or the Canary have to say, but more likely to care about what the New York Times and the Washington Post have to say, and certainly those around him. So it's definitely significant that they finally got their act together and understand the significance of this case that they seem to have been sort of asleep about. But yeah, you're right. There is a frightening degree of continuity, but
Yes.
and it is disappointing. But you're right, it's also not a big ask because, hey, you prosecuted it. Okay, admittedly, it was the last government, but they pushed it as hard as they could, and they really did push hard, and they lost. So there's no shame in saying, like, okay, well, a judge has said that he's at high risk of suicide if he comes here. We'll just leave it at that. 10 years of persecuting him, of him being deprived of his liberty, that's enough. But I suppose that's the difference between what people would like to believe, the sort of personalities that they project onto politicians, right? And belief systems, rather than the genuinely malevolent sort of mood that seems to be guiding at least some of those who make policy decisions, whether it's elements of the CIA who've really decided for many years that they want Julian Assange, and so therefore lean on other parts of the system, or whether it's just for politics' sake. Because frankly, unlike in at least some countries like Germany or Australia, and to a lesser extent the UK, the US, I think, other than Tulsi Gabbard and maybe one other, possibly a libertarian, right libertarian, Republican or
Yeah.
independent, I don't know
Yeah.
any members of Congress that just came out and said Julian Assange must not be extradited and face trial on espionage charges for his publications. And end of story. And Tulsi Gabbard was very strong about that, even when she was running for president, as I recall. Um,
Yeah.
and self-proclaimed socialists in the U.S. Congress, like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Maybe I expect less from corporatist, self-proclaimed moderates, although that's such a bogus terminology. Like, we don't use that term. Like, what's moderate about? So pro-war, pro-corporate. That's not moderates, right? That's Tariq Ali, the intellectual here and historian and playwright, wrote a book called The Extreme Center, and so that sort of makes sense. That's a bit more accurate. But the self-proclaimed socialists, I haven't heard anything from them in terms of those members in Congress, and that's sort of outrageous. So it's like, if you're a socialist, top at your list should be liberty. I know that may sound strange to some Americans, with the image of socialism as some kind of Stalinist bureaucracy or what have you, but that's not the ideal of socialism. It is a post-capitalist, egalitarian, democratic society. That is what socialism is meant to be about. And you can't really have that if you're prosecuting journalists using 100-year-old law that was primarily used to target and successfully destroy socialists, politicians, activists, and organizations who opposed U.S. involvement in the First World War. Over 3,000 men and women, at the very least, that we know of, because many cases aren't recorded, were arrested, prosecuted, and convicted for violating the Espionage Act, and then as it was also amended by the Sedition Act, because of their anti-war activities, because of speeches they give, literally just anti-war speeches, and because of handing out leaflets, encouraging people to refuse conscription. And that was made illegal under the Espionage Act, even though ostensibly it was about targeting possible German spies in the US. The primary targets were leftists and anti-war voices, and those convictions were held on appeal. It went all the way up to the US Supreme Court, case after case after case, because of the significance of them, and either rendering unanimous judgment or near unanimous judgment. Oliver Wendell Holmes, somebody who, when I went to law school, was taught to revere as this great progressive jurist, and in some respects he was, gave the leading opinion, where that famous expression comes from: freedom of speech does not allow you to yell fire in the crowded theater, which sounds reasonable. And when I was young, I thought that was literally a case about someone yelling fire in a crowded theater. And I thought, well, yeah, that obviously there are limits to free speech. It turns out, no, the fire in the crowded theater was somebody, it was Sneck v. USA, I think. It was somebody who was going to members of a fellow Yiddish community, I think, saying, working class men shouldn't be going off to Europe to kill other working class men. You should resist the draft. That was the fire. And he was convicted.
Yeah.
So that's the history of the Espionage Act, and how it is that you can have socialists. And I know Bernie Sanders will know this. He's got a picture of Eugene Debs in his office.
I was going to add that the part of the history, you can mention it, but the part of the history with Eugene being prosecuted.
Yeah, and convicted successfully, and upon appeal, his conviction was held on appeal, literally for a speech he gave, once again saying it's working class men who fight and die in these wars. It should be working class men, or the working class more generally, who decide matters of war and peace instead of the ruling class. And for that speech, he was arrested and convicted. And Eugene Debs was the leader of the Socialist Party, and he ran for president from prison. I think he got 1 million votes.
He got quite a few.
More votes than, I'm trying to think, how many third-party candidates when the population size was what, 1/3 or 1/4 of what it is now. No Twitter, no social media, right? From prison, he did better than most third-party candidates have decades later. So and this is the history of, actually, Consortium News has published a piece today on the history of the Espionage Act, but that is something that I think escapes us, although it was also, by the way, used to shut down newspapers, including a publication called The Masses, one of the most widely read papers in the United States, the second perhaps most widely read circular or paper, and it was a socialist, it was a left-wing paper, and it was shut down with the use of the Espionage Act. Although this Assange's prosecution would still be the first example of a journalist / publisher who's prosecuted under the Espionage Act. So it went from targeting anti-war voices on the left to then being used first under Nixon and then the vast majority under Obama administration to target whistleblowers. And now it's being, yes, exactly.
These are people who are protesting and raising their voice against war, just like
exactly what you would think that the First Amendment would be about, and also just violation, but surveillance, illegal mass surveillance, things like that. And now the next stage is to prosecute the publishers who merely republish what other people have provided them. So it's a very long, twisted and grim history in relation to the Espionage Act.
And Beacon Press was threatened, and that was involving the Pentagon Papers. And so, Kerry Shankman has a book that eventually will be more widely available, still in production, but he testified at the extradition trial. Lengthy testimony because of some of the most inane questions of the extradition trial from the prosecutors, but there was a lot that was dealt with as far as the procedural and case history of the Espionage Act. And so definitely there are connections that need to be made with the World War I era and this modern era. So there's some comments here, and then we'll begin to wrap. Got a comment that says Assange extradition means no more safety for journalists, publishers, political asylum seekers, and human rights activists. And we, the people, won't know anything. Crimes done by the government and corporations with zero awareness. And then we have a rather rhetorical question. If Trump didn't pardon Julian, do we really expect Biden to, being in the Clinton campaign? Although at this point, we're not asking for a pardon. That's why I said it was a low ask, because they're not asking for him to be cleared. They just want them to call off, for lack of a better phrase, the dogs, so to speak, and not hunt him down any longer. So then this comment is that Trump is, equal to Biden administration, but I think people used the slogan, this goes back to what we were talking about with the billboard, as a means to wake some sense in American public that this is an important issue and Assange needs to be freed. And then a question here about whether, we have any thoughts about how this might be resolved, and if he's just being written off because this is a political persecution. I think the point needs to be made. I don't know what you'd have to add as far as a comment, since you're across the pond, as we colloquially tend to say. And here in the US, there aren't any politicians that I know that have sent any staff members to follow any of these proceedings with Assange. By comparison, we can point to parliamentarians and staff of those parliament members who have sent people to follow the hearings in the Assange case and to take note of the crucial developments in order to understand what the implication will be if this case is successful against Assange. Again, I put it that way because it's not necessarily that they're supporters, but that they've taken seriously what this case would mean if the U.S. is able to bring Julian Assange to trial in the United States. So, how glaring is that? How is it? Does that kind of boggle your mind that there aren't any politicians at all in the U.S. Congress? I suppose a lot about the U.S. and maybe if you're cynical enough, you say, "Well, I get why they totally ignore it." But even people who don't support Assange are in Europe recognizing that this is an important case for their staff to track.
Yeah, I can only imagine what is going through, whether or not they've just paid very little attention and all they know is what the average person does when they flip on for 10 minutes on MSNBC. I think quite often people can want to believe that their politicians are worldly, highly knowledgeable, almost intellectual individuals who read, Immanuel Kant and Shadowproof and the whole spectrum of, But the reality is, I think quite often that's just an illusion. That's an image that most of them will get their opinions from the New York Times or the Washington Post. And although we've noted that they've gotten better, out of 50 articles, if only 3 or 4 of them happen to be solid, and you happen to miss those 3 or 4. And I don't know what kind of internal party messaging there's been, especially in the Democratic Party, of just leave this alone, especially given the fact that for 3+ years, Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, as part of a triumvirate or an axis of evil with Putin and Trump, were being continuously blamed as part of some kind of conspiracy. Now, never mind that the Mueller report found no actual evidence of such a conspiracy. Admittedly, in a part of the report that was redacted until 2 days or the eve of the 2020 election, which is dodgy as hell, right? Because there's no national security implications when you read the parts that have been unredacted. It's like, all this basically says is you found no evidence that would establish that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks either knowingly or even through willful ignorance collaborated or conspired conspired with Trump and elements of the Russian state. So, and also there's also a First Amendment defense that they would have in terms of publishing. So there's no evidence of a conspiracy, and they have a First Amendment defense. But we're going to redact that until the Biden-Trump election happens, and then we'll remove it. So even despite understanding all of that, yes, I was. It's still so fresh. It's like there are hundreds of members of Congress, right? So it's like how it. You think even just a few, but I suppose that just shows the level of groupthink, the level of fear. Fear implies that they know better. Fear, right? Because they could be just as brainwashed as the average person who has watched Rachel Maddow for 3 days, for 3 years, and literally thinks that Trump is a Manchurian candidate for Vladimir Putin. Even though I have to
Oh, yeah,
say,
absolutely.
Rachel Maddow has been very clever in constantly throwing in the word if. So if anyone ever goes to her and says, you said that Russia was responsible for switching off the electrical grid, or Trump was responsible for this peace deal was because Putin wants it. And she's like, well, actually, if you see her phraseology, she doesn't necessarily directly link cause and effect. She's constantly saying, like, well, we know Putin wants this. If the reason Trump is doing it is because of Putin, that would be a really big deal. But she does it so often, I think that eventually people miss the F, and they did the same thing with WikiLeaks constantly. So I suppose once the Democratic Party establishment decided to blame WikiLeaks, at least in part, for the loss of their candidate against Donald Trump, then it almost made him radioactive to politicians, unless it did take a degree of political courage, which I do think that people like Tulsi Gabbard did show, and others, frankly, did not. And I'm sorry to say that somebody that I might more ideologically align myself with, somebody like Bernie Sanders, at least in terms of many of his critiques, um, an extent at least, um, have fallen short on this
Yeah.
subject, which isn't just about one man, or even one man and his partner and his two children, or his friends and his family. It is about a terrible precedent that basically says it is okay for states to prosecute or seek the extradition of and launch prosecutions against people who aren't their citizens, who publish their secrets, having not been in the United States, taken no oath of office to the state or to the CIA, and having not been part of any kind of activity that could reasonably be said to like fall within the parameters of that state. And that means what's to stop China? If I happen to publish something based on state secrets in China exposing human rights abuses, and I'm visiting the Philippines, and then there's an extradition treaty between the Philippines and China, and the Chinese say, like, hey, we'd like Mohammed. Hey, well, if the Americans to do it, why can't we do it? And we
Yeah.
will see. Countries do copy. This is not just slippery slope hypothetical. Countries do copy each other. They copy each other with laws. They copy each other with policing and surveillance and other tactics. But they also look at what the main trend center is doing to see what could be acceptable and what's not acceptable. And to this day, for better or for worse, the United States is the most powerful state on the planet. And what it does reverberates, once again, for better or for worse, around the planet. So yeah, we'll see. But the pressure campaign is mounting, and the fact that it is now Biden and not Trump means I think there is more room to push people who might otherwise be concerned about appearing to side with a alleged Trump ally, even though I've seen no evidence that WikiLeaks or Trump or WikiLeaks or Assange or anything of the sort. But the hysteria, at least the madness, seems to be dying down.
So the photo I put up there were a small group of people in Tulsa, Oklahoma. That's flyover country in the United States. We usually don't see a protest or a demonstration for a political prisoner in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So there's some good organizing happening in the United States and around the world. A couple points to make as we wrap is first off, today is the runoff election in Ecuador. And so I thought the fact that this is happening the same time as the 2-year anniversary of Assange being expelled from the embassy, it's kind of poetic justice, because the ruling class in Ecuador was caught flat-footed by Andres Arauz, who is going to probably have a pretty good victory over his opponent Lasso, who is a banker, a corporate banker. And they didn't count on him being the person who would qualify for the runoff election. They had counted on a candidate named Yaku Perez. Without going into all the Ecuadorian politics, he did not make the top two. So they're in a weaker position. And what this means is the United States is going to see a left-wing candidate who I understand was Rafael Correa's pick to be the next president, someone he backed. And he's in exile because he's faced political charges from the Moreno government. Moreno, weeks ago, if not more than a month ago, was trounced at the polls, him and his party. I think they barely eked out like 10% of the vote, Moreno. And Moreno, of course, being the president who sold out Julian Assange to the Trump administration for like an IMF loan, something of that nature. You can say whatever you want.
No, yeah, you're right. It does appear, I mean, in terms of timing, in terms of getting, because people may not realize the United States is basically the main force behind the IMF, right? So if you're getting a loan from the IMF, you're really getting a loan from the countries which give the money the IMF give money to the IMF to loan, and the United States is the main creditor, if you like. So there was, if you look at the timing, it is very suspicious. We're talking about a few $1 billion, although Ecuadorians don't want. Most Latin Americans, if not all of them, do not want loans from the IMF, because with those loans come conditionalities, and those conditionalities are: we'll give you money, but you have to follow these policies which we think will be better for you and for humanity as a whole, which is vast mass wholesale privatization of all your public assets, including to foreign actors who can then come up and buy up your, whether it's oil or other mineral wealth or your healthcare system or whatever it is. Ideally, weaker union protections if you have any, reduced pay, minimum wage if you have any, privatization of a national service, national health care if it is public, things like that. So it's Lenin Moreno actually was the vice president to Rafael Correa, and when he ran explicitly on maintaining the same policies. So people say, well, why did they vote for this guy? People literally voted for somebody who campaigned on, we will continue the policies of our former president, Rafael Correa. And then he comes in and he consolidates power and he starts prosecuting former members, and then completely shifts in a different direction. So this is perhaps one of the most unpopular Latin American governments in decades, like incredibly unpopular. So yes, it is interesting. And just to get to the current election, Yaku Perez, some people were representing him as a progressive alternative to the other progressive alternative, right? To the one who's won the majority thus far. He's won a plurality. Sorry, that's why there's a second runoff, because he won more than any other candidate, but he didn't win enough, and apparently he didn't win enough to win outright. And so Yaku Perez was the preferred choice for the Americans, apparently. And he's indigenous. He's an indigenous person, although there's plenty, obviously, of people of mixed indigenous background. And there seem to be some people, lefties or quasi-lefties, saying, well, hey, this guy's great. We have two progressive candidates. It's like, well, first of all, Yaku Perez has actually backed the banker, the like market fundamentalist, let's privatize everything, reactionary banker. So there's nothing progressive about this dude. Like, I understand sometimes the impulse, but just because you're an indigenous person doesn't mean that you're automatically like an enlightened progressive person. Like, why would it mean that anymore? That being black or African American means that you're an enlightened progressive individual. I'm pretty sure Americans should have some experience now with
Yeah, no,
with that concept.
we're seeing any of these people could be used for corporate agendas globally.
Yeah, indigenous people are human beings, just like everybody else, and they come in all shapes and
Yeah.
sizes. So, if anybody had any doubt when he came out and he backed Lasso, the banker, that should have ended. That should have ended any doubt. And actually, I did an interview with the former Ecuadorian ambassador about the elections and about how it looks like the elements of the current regime are trying to undermine the electoral victory, electoral success. Um, and Yacu Perez, when the election was done, he challenged the election results, like all of them. But under the rules, you have to have some evidence to show that there's something dodgy. You have to say in this election area, there is this going on, and he didn't really substantiate that. And one thing he did was he gave a speech, public speech, in which he said, "This is just as the votes are coming in. I got a phone call from the American embassy, and they assured me that I'll be making it to the second round." And I remember thinking, can you imagine if I don't know, Trump had said, "I got a phone call from the Russian embassy" when he was running against Clinton, and they assured me
Yeah.
that I will. Okay, you don't have a second round, but like they assured me that I'll make it past the finish line. Like people would be
Yeah,
flipping
yeah.
out, and and it is outrageous. There was noted by Rafael Correa, I think on Twitter. I think he shared that. So
Yeah.
and that's what the Americans are doing in Ecuador. Although amazingly, thankfully, the Americans don't get the absolute final say. It was the banker who got to the second round. So anyway,
Yeah.
that's just more interesting politics of what's going on in Ecuador.
Well, they fractured their vote. They had Lasso and Perez in there, and they needed to pick one. And so they made the mistake that Biden didn't make because they got people out. I mean, I was in London the exact same time that the corporate Democrats made the choice that I think people in Ecuador are wishing they made, which was to form a coalition so that they could beat the, in this case, it's a little bit more pseudo left in the United States, but yeah, this is why Arauz is going to probably do pretty
Yeah, the
well.
ruling. Yeah. Yeah, well, they are themselves a coalition, the Citizens' Revolution, right? And bear in mind, under incredibly hostile circumstances, where the previous party was basically, disbanded. They couldn't form their own party. They had to run on the ticket of a different party, which is actually not a progressive party at all, but was so happy to get all this recognition, even though that recognition is really directed towards the progressive policies of the Citizen Revolution. The more so-called moderate, if you like, centrist party was happy for these people to run on their ticket. So it's actually a very hostile environment from the state, with criminal prosecutions against people and all kinds of shenanigans, if you like. And they still did well. And I think one of the differences between what's going on there in the United States, in addition to the success of the grassroots movement in Ecuador, like we've seen in other Latin American countries, where people have, like Bolivia, where the parties really are connected to a wider movement and organizational, like grassroots organizational structure, rather than just a thing where you go and you fill out your name and you're a member of a political party. It is there is a greater like communal element there, which is fundamental. But also, as you point out, with Biden, the ruling class appear more united in the United States and more split under the current crisis of what's going on in Ecuador, which is why it's easier for Obama to have a backroom chat with the other, corporate Dems and say, why don't you gracefully pull out? Let Biden run against Sanders so you don't split the vote among your various corporate neoliberal voters. And then that way you'll get some, I don't know, minister for transport or whatever it is that I'm trying to think. Was that Pete Buttigieg, or there's his clone? There's another one. I was confused with two because they're so similar. They're so similar to each other for me. One of them is Pete Buttigieg, and the other one is the mayor. Or no, is he from memory?
Pete was a mayor.
Yeah, Pete was the mayor. He got minister for transport, or secretary of state for transport.
Yes,
right?
yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there's the other one who's also some kind of vacuous, sort of like wannabe Obama person who speaks with that cadence, right? Another West Wing type figure. If you
Yeah.
ever watch the show.
Yeah. No,
So
they
yeah,
that's the entire that's the Biden White House though. That's like a qualification that you can speak in that dialogue if you want to join. Um,
as long as you haven't
uh,
smoked weed, apparently. So
right. Yeah. 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 Or only the ones that are friends. If you're in our circle and you are a pothead before, you could be a part. But if we don't really know you, then that's going to be difficult for us to
yeah,
get
exactly.
cleared, I
Which
guess.
is which is
So,
ironic. Sorry, I know you want to you want to
um,
wrap up. So
well, I had one more thing. I think we should. I want to end with Stella Morris's statement, but there's just a couple things here. Uh, a good supporter of the show reminds me that Action for Assange is in Los Angeles right now at CNN Hollywood, and they have a live stream. So if you want to hop off and tune into that after we get done, they're still out there doing their demonstration. They've had events for the last 24 hours, for 24 to 48 hours. And these people uh, did some really good work during the trial to cover it really early in the morning from the States. By the way, it's Beto O'Rourke. I think you're kind of thinking of. Uh,
yeah,
yeah, that's one of our viewers reminds us that it was Beto, who didn't really make it very far. Then the other thing that I wanted to put out there is before we do conclude with Stella's statement, why don't you just take a moment to plug anything you would like, or specifically, I was thinking, why don't you tell people about the recent interview you did with Jeffrey Sterling, so people could go read that at Jacobin, since it was on his thoughts about Assange.
Yes. So Jeffrey Sterling, former CIA whistleblower, a fascinating and tragic tale, although not completely tragic because he's still fighting the good fight. He actually wrote an excellent article in the Dissenter, which is you may have heard of it, Kevin. I think you have something to do with that. And so and yeah, I interview him basically because I wanted to say one of my questions was literally, why did you penned this article in the Dissenter? Why is that?
Oh yeah.
But I start off by asking him about his experience because he was prosecuted and tried under the Espionage Act in the Eastern District of Virginia, which is the same court and of course the same law which Julian Assange faces should he be extradited. And the same law that's being used against him. So people can go to Jacobin and check that out. And I've got a couple other pieces over there. And there'll be, I think I've published something on electronic intifada and possibly future pieces as well, covering Palestinian direct action activists who've been targeting an Israeli weapons manufacturer here in Britain, which sells weapons to like dozens of other countries as well, drones, armed drones, and surveillance systems, etc. And they're on trial for conspiracy because they've thrown paint on the factories and smashed windows and stuff like that, because they're saying they're trying to undermine war crimes, like greater crimes, basically. So it's going to be a fascinating case of going on over there. So yeah, check out Electronic Intifada, the Canary, and Jacobin magazine. I tweet out. People can see my Twitter handle over there. I tweet out my pieces that I publish. So thanks for that, Kevin.
That's all excellent. So let's just conclude with Stella's words that she had for this dismal, if not, I guess, potentially hopeful anniversary, because we have seen a surge in the activism and support for Assange worldwide. And I remind people that as awful as it is for him to still be in detention, they are in a position where they're in the winner's seat because they did not lose the extradition case in January. And so it's on the United States to win on appeal if they would like to keep Julian in this horrible limbo that he's been in, this this the state of arbitrary detention for over a decade. So there is, it's still pretty cloudy. and grim, but some of the clouds are leaving the sky. And so this is from Stella. She put a case update together, and she said that this marks the beginning of the third year of Julian's incarceration. He has had 2 full years in the Belmarsh prison. Protests and solidarity actions are planned around the world to raise awareness. Reporters Without Borders has changed its banner into a Free Assange message for the anniversary. When I tell Julian about these actions, it lifts his spirits. Anniversaries are a platform to educate, nurture compassion and solidarity, and bring like-minded people on board. I was recently speaking to someone who was not particularly familiar with the case. The striking thing to them, they said, was the passage of time. It changes people's perception of the situation. Remind people that the judge threw out the U.S. extradition request in January. Remind them that Julian published information because he defends people's right to know what the government does in their name. Remind them that he has done nothing wrong, and to put him in prison is to criminalize journalism. Remind them that he has a family and that he is suffering. And then she encouraged people to participate in solidarity actions and protests, and to not forget to take pictures. So, yeah, there's been quite a lot of actions around the world. It's good to see that a day like this happens and it's not all forgotten and ignored, that he's been in detention for so long, at least this phase of his detention. You know, Juan Passarelli correctly reminds everyone that more than 11 years of arbitrary detention. So marking this anniversary is like an anniversary within a more longer time frame of something that has been unfolding. And that was Stella, his fiance, and mother of his 2 children. And so I think we can wrap. If there's anything you would like to say before we go. Okay, great. So thanks everyone for tuning in to this broadcast. We'll stay up to date on everything that is happening in this case, and we'll be back in the future with more live streams on WikiLeaks and other issues. Until then, if you would like to support the work that I'm doing, you can find me over at shadowproof.com, or the Dissenter newsletter at dissenter.substack.com. And then this also, I used the Rockfin channel that I have for my unauthorized disclosure podcast and stream this there as well. So that's another way if you want to support this journalism. So much respect and love to all of you for tuning into this little show this afternoon and this evening if you're in Europe. And we'll talk to you all later.